Don't be this guy walking around with your computer open all the time because you can't let Claude stop running while you walk across the office. Instead, I'm going to tell you how to set up a computer in your house that just keeps running all the time that you can use to be your development machine for super cheap. And all we're going to need for this is a Raspberry Pi or really any other computer that you can leave running. And these tools, these ones are free. This one's not free, but you know that. You've paid for AI. I'm going to do a little intro into what these tools are. If you're not interested, if you already know it, skip ahead to the next chapter in the video where I walk through how to set this up on your Raspberry Pi or whatever development machine you want. So mise is a very simple kind of machine setup tool for installing programming languages and tools. Obviously, you can install them manually, your own way, whatever. Mise has the advantage of keeping your environment separate for different projects, similar to some of the tools that are already out there for different programming languages. But this is one tool that works for pretty much every programming language and allows you to install programming languages and programming dev tools and keep those environments separate, and then keep information about the programming language, environment, the version number, and all that stuff in with the project so that it's very easy to get up and running on a different machine using mise there as well. Tailscale is how we're going to get remote access from anywhere without having to deal with all the complicated networking stuff that comes with ports and port forwarding and IP addresses and DNS and all that kind of stuff. We don't need that. We've got Tailscale. Tailscale is super easy. If you haven't done it, go ahead and go to Tailscale.com, set up your account so that you're ready when we get to the walkthrough later and you've got your account already set up. And the last one that we'll talk about here is Zellij. Zellij is just a way to keep stuff running over SSH. Normally, if you log into SSH and start up Claude or Codex or whatever, and then disconnect from SSH because you have to move your laptop from one building to the other or whatever, your stuff's going to stop working. Well, with Zellij, we can log in over SSH, start up a Zellij session, and then that's going to keep that running even after we disconnect. We can log back in, reconnect. There's other tools that do this, Screen and Tmux. They're fine, but they have complicated keyboard shortcuts, and Zellij is just, in my experience, easier to work with. So that's the one that I choose. So let's jump in and get it started.
To start out, we're going to start at the very basics. The very first thing you're going to need to do is image your Raspberry Pi device with Pi OS, or the Raspberry Pi operating system. So we're going to open up the Raspberry Pi imager that hopefully you already have downloaded to your computer, and then you're going to select the version of Raspberry Pi that you have. I have a Pi 4 that I'm doing for this example. And then once we do that, we're going to go to the next selection, which is the operating system. Now, you could choose to install just the basic Pi operating system that it shows up at the top of the screen there. And that's great if you want to have a desktop, plug it into a monitor, hook up a keyboard, mouse, and use it basically as a computer in addition to the things that we're going to do with it. But if you would rather just have it be just acting as a server, you're going to scroll down and select Raspberry Pi OS Other. And then under the other selection, you can choose Raspberry Pi OS Lite, and you're going to want the 64-bit version as long as your Raspberry Pi supports it. Once we do that, then we need to select our storage device, and I forgot to plug mine in, so let me plug that in real quick. And once I plug in, this is the micro SD card, and I have a little SD card reader, and I plug that in, and then it shows up there. Make sure you select the right one. If you've got multiple USB drives plugged in, make sure you pick the right one, because otherwise you can overwrite data that you actually want. Then we're going to enter the host name. I like Claude as a host name, but you can choose whatever you want. Then we'll go capital city, just selecting the localization, basically what our location is, and time zone. And I know America, Denver, so I got to scroll up a little bit to get there. And then we've got our keyboard layout. I like US. That's fine. We'll enter in now our username and password. Now on this next page, you have the option to I'm not going to put that information in because if you want to connect this Raspberry Pi via Wi-Fi, this is where you would put in the SSID or the network name and the network password to be able to connect to that network so that after you image your Raspberry Pi, it will immediately connect to the Wi-Fi instead of you having to log in and configure that. On the next page, we need to enable SSH authentication because we're not going to have a display hooked up to this. and we're only going to connect it to it over the network, I want SSH connectivity, and we're going to use password authentication for now. We'll set up public key authentication a little bit later. If you already know about public key authentication and you want to copy in your public key right here, you can do that. We don't need Raspberry Pi Connect, so we'll leave that disabled. We're going to bypass the need for that with Tailscale. And on this last page, we click right, and I understand we're blowing up everything that's on that drive and connecting it on my computer. Once you click right, you might have to enter a password. Just put in your password and then let it write. It's going to take a while. I'm going to speed this up. And once that's done, write is complete. We now have a micro SD card ready for use in our Raspberry Pi. Once you get to this point, you can click finish, take the micro SD card from your computer and plug it into the Raspberry Pi. You should pretty easily be able to spot the little slot where that goes. And then you can plug in power to the Raspberry Pi, and it will either connect to your Wi-Fi network or you need to plug in the Ethernet cable so that it connects there. Once we do that, we need to open up a terminal on our computer to connect via SSH like we talked about. So I'm going to open up a new terminal on my computer and type SSH. Now, when we're SSHing into the machine, we need to put our username. So username at hostname.local. And with that syntax, if we are on the same network as the device that we're trying to connect to, which hopefully we are, right? Then we will get this SSH authenticity notification. And if you just type yes, then we'll accept that. And then you can type in the password that you put in that configuration, and we're in. You can see the terminal has changed now. It says Ryan at Claude, because that is the host name and the username of the machine that we are connecting to. And now that we're connected to the machine, we're going to start configuring and setting up some tools. And we're going to start by installing mise by typing this curl command. And once that runs, then it'll have a little instruction here to copy some configuration to activate mise into your bash configuration. So I'm just going to copy that and paste it into the terminal and hit enter. And now I can try to run mise, and it's going to give me an error because I haven't actually run that yet. But if I either run that source command or reconnect, and I'm just going to disconnect and reconnect, now I can see that mise runs and the software is installed and working. Once we have mise, we can use mise to install Zellij. So we'll type mise use-g Zellij at latest, and it shouldn't take too terribly long. And that is now installed. And now we can run Zellij by just typing Zellij there at our terminal. We don't have to log out and log back in for this one. And once we do that, we're going to select our mode for interacting with Zellij. I like the default mode. It's great, super easy, doesn't really conflict with many things. But if you would like to use the unlock first mode where you have to type Control-G before you use any of the other commands, that is entirely up to you. So I'm going to select the default here. And once I select the default, I can type Control-P to control the panes. So you can see it at the bottom. There are a list of commands. So Control-G will lock it, Control-P for panes, Control-T for tabs. And you can look elsewhere for more instructions on how to work with Zellij. But the first one we'll do is Control-P and then R, and that opens up a new pane. So I can type in one of them. Right. I can type in the other one. You can see now I have connected over SSH here. I have two different terminals exit and leave that I'm interacting with, and I could do different things. I could have Claude running in one and an editor running in another. I could have Claude running in both of them in two different folders, or two different versions of Claude in the same folder. There's really no limit to what you could do with these different terminals. Now, the next thing we're going to do is install Claude Code. So if you go to Claude Code, just Google install Claude Code, you can get this command. The command's here on the screen if you'd like to type it out, and you can just copy and paste that. I like the native install. There's other ways that you can install it as well. So I'm just going to paste that command in here, and again, hit enter, and let that install run and do its thing. We'll speed this up here. And once that's done, I can type Claude login, and that I select a couple default options here, use the browser to sign in. It's not going to be able to open the browser because we're connected over SSH and the computer that we're connected to doesn't have the browser, but we can highlight the link that it gives me and press C to copy that link as it says, and then I'll paste that into a browser on my end, log into Claude, and then I take the code that it gives me and paste it back in, and then we're ready to use Claude on our remote machine. So we'll get past our little warning that Claude can make mistakes, assert that we trust this folder that we're in. Yeah, I like the new full screen renderer. Why not? Hit enter, and we'll give that a try. And again, trust the folder, and now here we are with our working Claude instance. The next thing that we're going to do is set up some settings. And these are personal preference. You don't have to do this, but this is what I like to do. If you scroll down a bit in the settings, there are options for push notifications, push when actions are required, and push when Claude decides. Whether you want those or not is up to you. That's if you want a push notification. Through Claude, if Claude Code needs your input, then you can do that. And then the very last option, I think it's the very last option on the page, is to enable remote control for all sessions. And that means by default, when I start Claude Code on this server, the Claude Code remote control will be enabled, meaning I can get to it through Claude, the desktop application, on my laptop, on my phone, or wherever I want to do it. So I'll enable remote control for all sessions. And then I actually want to go up. There's one more setting that I want to change, and that's the default permission mode. I like auto mode as the default. Auto mode means you don't need as many permissions dialogues to give Claude permission to edit a file or run a command or do those things, but with still a little bit of a safety harness so that it won't run dangerous commands. Now, it's not perfect, but the nice thing about having this running on a separate computer that's not connected to my email or my data, and it only has access to the data that I give it, is that I can have it run kind of whatever it wants and have less risk of compromise of my data. Now, no risk, it's not perfect, but I'm willing to trust it. You can make your own decision whether you want to use auto mode by default. But I'm going to set up auto mode, and then we'll just hit escape to close the settings. And now those are the default settings for every session of Claude Code that I do on this Raspberry Pi. And you can see I've got RC active in the corner, meaning remote control is active. And what that means is now I can pull in Claude on my desktop or on my laptop and see in Claude, in the desktop application, this Claude Code session. And I can interact with it. I can tell it to do stuff. I can get notifications and basically interact with it as if I was logged in over SSH, but now without having to stay logged in over SSH. And like I said in the intro at the beginning, Zellij means that this session is going to stay running even if I'm completely not connected via SSH. So you can see there under the code tab, I can click on login, and that's the new prompt that I have. And there I can tell it to do something, create a file, run some code, do some code, whatever it is that I want. And now that auto mode setting that I set still hasn't applied because that only applies on a new session by default. So that's why it asks me here for permission to create this file, but I'm going to just always allow that. And you can see kind of in the background that the terminal window's changing. And once it's done, I'll just move this out of the way, and you can see it's created the file. I'm going to change the mode here locally with Shift-Tab. You can do that at any time in a Claude Code session. I'm going to shift that to be in the auto mode like I want, and like I said, each new session is going to start that way. But now I can open up a new pane and see that that file's created, and I can look at the contents, and it says this is neat, just like I told it to. So now we're going to do some other configuration things. The first one we're going to do is just quit out of Claude Code here. The next thing that we want to do is install Tailscale. And if we look up the instructions to install Tailscale on Linux, we can just go to that page and again, just copy the command. I trust Tailscale. They're a reputable company. If you don't trust them, you are welcome to follow the more intensive process of reviewing the packages. But I'm just going to copy this command from their website and paste that into the terminal on my remote machine. And again, make sure that your terminal says your username at the remote machine's host name, and you're not installing Tailscale on your local laptop. Although you should install Tailscale on your laptop, because otherwise this won't work. First, you need to install Tailscale on your laptop, set up your Tailscale account, and then once you have set up your Tailscale account, then you can go through the process of configuring Tailscale on the remote machine. So we're going to do that. We're going to let that run. Yours will take longer than this is because I'm speeding it up again. And once we do that, it tells us to run sudo tailscale up. And I'm going to run sudo tailscale up. And then, kind of similar to the Claude Code login, it gives me a link. I can copy that link, paste it into the browser on my laptop to authenticate. Might need to re-put in passwords and things. And once I authenticate there and say, yes, this is a device that I want to add to my network, it's in. And this Raspberry Pi is now connected to Tailscale. If I go to the Tailscale website, I can see it on my list of devices. And most importantly, now I'm going to exit Zellij by typing Control-Q. And then I'm going to exit the SSH session because that was connected only through that local network, that Claude.local name. And that's only going to work if I am still on the same network that the Raspberry Pi is on. But Tailscale lets me connect from anywhere using that same name, that host name. And you can change the host name on the Tailscale website if you want to. But I can SSH Ryan at Claude, and now I don't need the .local because my laptop is connected to Tailscale, my Raspberry Pi is connected to Tailscale, and I can use just the Tailscale host name of Claude to log into there. And that will work whether I'm on the same network as the Raspberry Pi or anywhere else I have an internet connection. And here we're going to get that SSH confirmation again because we're connecting to a new name. It's not Claude.local anymore. It's just Claude. And it's saying, I haven't seen this device before, although I have seen it before under a different name. Do you want to still connect? We type yes and hit enter, and then off we are to the races once we put in our password. And you'll see I SSH'd in, and I'm now connected, Ryan at Claude. We are reconnected to that session. And I can type Claude here in that session, trust the folder, and now I'm going to use Claude to update the configuration of my Raspberry Pi in a way that lets it behave a little bit more in the way that I want. So we've got auto mode on, like I said, and the first thing that I'm going to do is create a bash alias for Zellij so that I can always reconnect to the same session. By default, when you run the command Zellij, it creates a new session with a new kind of randomly assigned name, which means that every time I'd have to remember what the name is or use the session manager to pull back up the old session. And instead, I want to create an alias that's always going to connect me to the same session. So I can just log into the machine and type Z, and that will reconnect me to the same session every time by giving it a name. So I'm telling it to create a bash alias called Z that automatically starts Zellij with a session name of Claude Pi and will reconnect to the session if it already exists. And these are all command line options that you can pass to Zellij to do that, and Claude knows that perfectly well. So it says, yes, the alias is not there. I can use attach -- create or the -c to do that. Here's what I want to do to your bash RC. And it did it. And now that new command is there. So I now have an alias called Z that I can just type, and that will automatically connect me to a session called Claude Pi. So it tells me I need to run source ~/.bashrc to kind of reload the bash configuration so that I have access to that alias. And then I can just run Z to do it. And here's that command again that it typed. So I'm going to quit out of Claude, and then I can run that source command. Or, again, you can always just log out and log back in, and that will run your .bashrc, and you'll have access to those same things. And then we'll run Z. And now you can see I've started a new session, but most importantly, that session is now named. And every time I run Z, I will reconnect to that same session. And you can see the session's name up here in the corner, and I can run stuff. Here, I'll type a message for myself in the future. And then I'm going to type Control-O-D. Control-O is the Zellij command to interact with session controls, and D is to detach from that session. So I detached from the Zellij session without closing the SSH session at all. And now I can disconnect from the SSH session, or I can rerun Z. There you can see we're right back in that same session. That thing that I had typed, that this is a cool thing, is still there. and anything that I had running before, if I had Claude running before, let's see what that looks like. I'll run Claude. Now I'm inside the Zellij session, running Claude, and now I can Control O D again to detach, and type Z again, and we're right back in Claude. And I can even log completely out of the machine by typing exit, type Z, and I'm right back in that Claude session. So that Claude session has kept running even after I disconnected from SSH. Now we're going to use Claude to do some more configuration. In fact, we're going to use Claude to configure itself. The first thing we're going to do is tell Claude that mise is installed on this computer, and that is how we want to manage programming environments. So this will set up a global Claude.markdown file. And in that global Claude.markdown file, it will instruct Claude that mise is here. And if we want to install Python or install Node.js or install Elixir or install any number of programming tools, that the default way that it should be trying to do that is with mise, because it's there and it's easier to do it that way than to do it through manual downloads or through package managers or anything like that. So that's the first thing we're going to do. The next thing that we're going to do is tell Claude that this is a remote development machine. And this one's important because by default, when you start up a development server, that development server is only going to be accessible from localhost. Meaning, if you open up a browser on your machine and try to access a development server that's running on your Raspberry Pi, you won't be able to get there because the server won't be listening. But if you tell Claude, again, that this is a remote development machine and that when it starts up development servers, it needs to start them up to be accessible over that Tailscale network, then it can do that, and it will do that, and it will automatically set things up to make that possible. So we're going to tell Claude this as a part of its configuration to set up CLAUDE.md so it knows to start development servers to be accessible over Tailscale as well as from localhost. And you can see it walks through exactly what it did. If you want to read through that whole thing, yours will tell you a whole bunch of information. But really all this is doing is saying that when I'm running Claude and I'm running development servers, those need to be accessible from Tailscale and not just on the local machine. And let's just test it out. We'll have it start up a basic development server, just a super basic Node.js server. And you can see it does that. It's following our instruction to use mise to install Node.js, binding that server to 0.0.0.0 so that every IP address coming in can get to it. Once that's done running, I can pull up the browser on my local machine. This is now on my laptop. Pull up the browser on my laptop and go to http://Claude:3000, port 3000, and that information was given to me by Claude. And it's important to put the http:// because otherwise your browser will probably just search for Claude instead of connecting to that address. But once you do that, http:// that host name again and the port number that you're given by your development server, then you can see we have something super basic, but this is how you can be running a development server on your Claude machine and access that development server from anywhere at any time. So you can be watching it develop, verifying functionality, reviewing error messages on the server itself, and having the server itself manage those error messages and responding to those and adapting and fixing those, all over Tailscale. Before we quit, we'll just have it stop the server, and it stops it, and then we're good to go. So now that you've got that, it's time to get building.